Thank you so much for coming this evening. Thank you, Roma. Thank you, Franco. And thank you, of course, Professor Millani, for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be here. And as you'll see, my book actually has a special connection to Stanford. Before I start, I have to ask you one thing, and that is, which my publisher made me swear to do, which is to follow me on Twitter, on Facebook, and on any other social media platform. Because one of the things that has happened with this book is I wrote an academic book, the way academics write a book, in a library in my sweatpants, and then the book became larger and got a New York Times review, and it became a kind of popular book, and my publisher said, "You're not on social media, this is horrible, you need to have a Twitter following." So wherever I go, I have to ask people to follow me. And then that we get that out of the way, we can talk about the book. So, let's see. This book has been a very long time in the making. And 10 years ago, more or less, I started working on it, even more than 10 years ago. The book that I started by writing out was a book about this man, a man with whom I lived for the first 18 years of my life, but did not know very well. My father. A kind of quiet, slightly remote, slightly depressive, enigmatic man. And I knew a few things about him. And I should say I was born and raised in Israel. I knew my father was born in a Polish town called Ostrów Mazowiecka. I knew he had come to what was pre-state Israel, to Palestine, with a group of children called Yaldei Tehran in Hebrew, or Tehran Children. So I knew he had come to Palestine through Iran during World War II. I did not think of him, nor did he present himself as a Holocaust survivor. Holocaust survivors were the people with the tattoos on their arms, people who had been in camps, and to me he was simply an Israeli man who was my father. My father died in 1993, so he died fairly young from Yaakov Creutzfeldt disease, which is mad cow disease that we know, and so a degenerative brain disease. And very shortly after I came here and I studied, I got a PhD, I became a professor, and I didn't really do any research about my father's history until 2007. In 2007, so I'm a professor at City College, and I'm at a faculty end-of-the-year party, and I have an Iranian-American colleague, and the Iranian-American colleague says to me, "Hey, you know anything about Jewish children who were in Iran during the war?" And I say, as a matter of fact, I do. Now, if you remember, 2007 was the year of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's, when he was a prime minister, and there was all the talk about his Holocaust denials, and then a kind of articles came out about more generally accusing Iran of being complicit in the Holocaust. And at that time, Professor Millani, right here, wrote an article in the Iranian that was a kind of defense of Iran during the Holocaust, and I'll just read you a little bit. So he basically, Professor Millani said that he says the facts of history are just the opposite of what was claimed about Iran, and he gave various examples of Iran's help to Jewish refugees and people, persecuted people under the Nazis. And he ends his article by saying, moreover, when the Nazi killing machines began their slaughter of innocent Polish Jews, 1,388 Jews, including 871 children, were moved to Tehran, where they lived in relative safety until they moved to Israel. History of Contemporary Iranian Jews, which is a publication, has provided an account of what are called the Tehran Children. So Salar shows me this article on his computer. I'm like, what? this is crazy. So, but when he asked me, how did they get there? Who brought them there? What happened to them? I had no idea. Really, in truth, Tehran was not even exactly a place in my mind. It was just a name of these children, Tehran Children. So that's the origin of this book. So 10 years later, and many drafts and whatnot later, this is the book, and it really begins with this quote from Professor Melloni in the introduction. But the book that I ended up writing is not just about my father, and it's also not just about these nearly 1,000 Tehran children. The book that I ended up writing is about most Polish Jews who survived Nazi extermination. And Professor Melloni and I were just talking about this, and this is kind of astonishing, but to be very crude about the numbers, so there were roughly 3.5 million Jews in Poland before the war. 90% of them were killed or died during the war. So 350,000 or so survived. Of these 350,000, 250,000, so roughly 250,000, survived in the way that I describe in the book, which means in Soviet Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and then in Iran, in Palestine, in Lebanon, in India, and other places. So I ended up writing about the majority of Polish Jewish survivors who have never been recognized as survivors. These are people who have not been commemorated. They have not been, in 1952 there was a reparations agreement between Germany and Israel. These people were not included in the reparation agreement. And they have not really been studied very much, despite about 3 decades of very intense Holocaust research. I was just telling Professor Melloni that the Holocaust Museum in Washington and the Smithsonian are actually going to do an event for this book in June, because they have not, the Holocaust Museum, right, which is the place for Holocaust memorialization, has not really had very much, they had things in their archives, but they didn't really have this as a story. So there was no story, and I ended up writing the story of these refugees of the East, among whom was my father. And I think if you end up reading the book, you'll see that, so the book is on the one hand a kind of huge history book with footnotes, but it's also an intimate story of a daughter and a father, and really a kind of second-generation memoir of a different kind. And in some ways, a second-generation memoir of a survivor who had the symptoms of a survivor without the story of a survivor. And I wrote my father's story and the story of all these people. So what I want to do today is to contemplate the fates of these people, and with this, of course, with a special emphasis on Iran. So if we can start thinking about the fate of these people by imagining 2 children, a boy and a girl, 12 and 8. The children live in their siblings. They live in Poland, a country where the majority of Polish Jews live. This is 1939. They live in a town where 30% of the population is Jewish, 60% during their parents' time. So this is a very Jewish town. The children have never left home, or rather, the girl has never left her hometown. The boy, my father, obviously left his hometown once for a tonsillectomy in Warsaw, which is 60 miles away. So these children grew up in this very sheltered, bourgeois, Jewish family in Ostroma-Zowiecka. The family has been in this town for 8 generations. So I've also been able to trace their pre-war life, and they've really been in this town more than anybody else, including Christian Poles. Now, imagine these children 3 years later. Of course, I don't have their photos particularly, but this is the photo of the refugees. These are Polish refugees, and Polish soldiers of the Andres army, among whom these children are embedded. They are disembarking at Bandar Pahlavi, which is today Bandar Anzali. They are thinner, they weigh less than they did 3 years earlier. They have been refugees for 3 years. They are without their parents and without any other adult relatives. In a few weeks, they are collected into a tent camp into the outskirts of Tehran. This tent camp, actually, maybe I want to show you the journey. So they're 5,000 miles away from home. And if you can see, this is where they started out, Ostromazovechka. They have gone all the way to the northern Soviet Union, to Arkhangelsk, and then all the way south, through Samarkand, Turkmenistan, crossing the Caspian Sea, and they're now here in Bandar Pahlavi. So these two children who basically have never left home have traversed half the world, basically. And I don't know if people here have children. When I started working on this, I have a son, and he was 6, and I would be like, I can't even get him to walk from like the middle of the block to the end of the block, and I'm looking at 5,000. I mean, it's very astonishing. So the Jewish children are taken to a tent camp in the outskirts of Tehran. This is what is called the Jewish Children's Home, is part of a larger Polish refugee camp inside a former Iranian Air Force base in Dushan Tope. And they have counselors, and after several months, about 7 months, they are transferred. They're transferred to Palestine, and we'll talk about that later. But after their arrival, they arrive. I mean, most of them arrive. There are 2 transports in March 1942 and in August 1942. My father came in August 1942 after their arrival. So a month later is the Jewish high holidays, and the children are taken to a synagogue in Tehran. This is the Chaim and Daniel synagogue. It still exists. This is actually it looks the same as I understand. And if you look at this is the Torah Ark, and I don't know if anybody here can read Hebrew, but it says Bet HaKnesset HaYehudim HaEropim, the synagogue of the European Jews. So this is actually a Persian synagogue that a part of it has been cordoned off for the European Jews to be able to pray there, because they're Ashkenazi and they pray differently than the local Jews. So how did these 2 children and these others get from Ostromazovechka to Tehran? To understand that, I'll give you a very, very, very short history overview. So we know World War II, 1939, Poland is partitioned between the Germans and the Soviets. This is the partition. Warsaw falls on the German side, Bialystok falls on the Soviet side. Ostromazovechka is really here, it's right next to the border. But by early 1940, about 1.5 million Polish Jews live within Soviet borders, whether they fled there, like my family. And again, we have to understand that these are very difficult decisions. I mean, these people don't know what's going to happen, and they don't know who will be worse, the Soviets or the Germans. But many people flee, and many people simply live in those towns. They fall under Soviet occupation, and about a third of these are deported to the Soviet interior. They're deported, never mind the reason, and we can talk about that, but they are deported to what are called special settlements. So they're not exactly gulags as we know gulags from the literature. They're not supposed to be penitentiary, but in fact they are penitentiary, especially for these are mostly urban people, and they're not used to cutting down trees, that's for sure, in very, very difficult conditions. This is what it looked like. And the Soviets estimate that about 25% of the exiles died right there in the settlements. And this is a probably conservative estimate. Within, and so people are in the settlements. As we know, in 1949, the Wehrmacht, the German army, invades the Soviet Union. After that, the exiles are released from the special settlements by a special decree of Stalin. And what we have to understand, and this is really in one of those like strange arbitrary fates of history, basically these people are saved by their deportations, right? Because when the Nazi army invades the Soviet Union, it doesn't get that far into the Soviet interior. So basically, when the army invades, they kill those people who are in the border towns, but they don't get this far. So these people are saved by their deportations, and are released, and are sent on a kind of second deportation. This is what the deportation card looks like, to Soviet Central Asia, to Uzbekistan mostly, but also to Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. They're sent there. I mean, I interviewed many people, and many people say to me, I went there because I had asthma, and my dad wanted me to take me to a dry place. But it was not like that. This was the Soviet Union. You were sent to to a Kazakh family, and you would say you have to go to stay with this Kazakh family. They had to take you, and you had to go there. But still, there was a little bit more leeway. Uzbekistan, Soviet Central Asia is, the situation there is actually worse than in Siberia, because Soviet Central Asia is the labor front of the Soviet army, which means that their food products are being confiscated in order to feed the Red Army. Not 95%, 100%. And so basically you have a kind of starving land with the refugees at the bottom of this food chain. The situation is very difficult. So when an opportunity arises for the Polish army in exile, so basically consists mostly of Christian Poles with some Jewish Poles, when an opportunity arises for 1,000 or so Jewish children to be evacuated to Iran together with the Polish army, my grandparents and many other Polish Jews jump on it and say, basically, we'll send our children, and we will not, whatever happens, maybe we won't be saved, but our children will be saved. And of course, as you can imagine, this was a very, very difficult decision. The separation from the children, and I think, today we see children being separated from parents, which, it's just awful. And this is a very, very traumatic moment that is described in very many memoirs as a traumatic moment, but they do it, and it's a very sad moment. However, when the children a week later arrive in Iran, this is a kind of, Iran is described as a kind of heaven. They've come to heaven, more or less. But these, by the way, are Jewish refugees in Bukhara in 1944. So basically the majority of Jewish refugees end up staying for the duration of the war in Central Asia. And as you can see, they're holding actually a Yiddish paper. I mean, they basically remain there, and many of them remain there even after the war, including my grandparents. This is Bandar Pahlavi in 1942 or 3. And I want to read to you one of the nicest sources that I have is a travel diary that one of the children wrote. So this is a Jewish-born child from Warsaw. He wrote a travel diary in Polish. I translated it into English. And this is what he writes about his arrival in Iran on the day that they arrive. His name is Emil Landau. On the historic day of August 16, 1942, in 40 degrees and some weather, the first group of passengers leaves on the tugboat's dock, and after a half-hour sail, gets to the small port Bandar Pahlavi. Difficult to transmit in writing our first impression. Each one feels as if he is born again, has come to a place out of this world. The port's waters are littered with colorful boats. The surroundings are mowed lawns and flower beds. Rows of impressive Chevrolets and Studebakers wait for transport, and everything seems good and beautiful. Everything smiles together with the Persians, who gaze at us with pity. After we are on shore, everyone hugs everyone. And this is an incredibly moving description, and there are many such descriptions. Now, the Studebakers, I don't know if anybody can guess where they came from. America, right? So the fact, this is when the land lease agreement is signed. Basically, American aid is starting to be shipped to the Allies, and much of that aid is shipped in the form of trucks, military trucks that are shipped through Iran. So this is a Life magazine ad from 1943. In the background is Iran, and it says, Studebaker military trucks, like our Yanks, are certainly seeing the world. And of course, so you have these Jewish, Polish children, including my father, who actually, so the family owned a brewery, and they had Studebaker trucks, and here he's in Iran. The first thing that he's seeing are Studebaker trucks. It's one of those crazy wartime coincidences. Now, the Iran that my father comes to, as many of you in this room know, in the beginning of the war was a neutral state, right? A neutral state with strong ties to Germany, in the sense that we have German engineers working in Iran, helping to build roads and railroads and so on in the 1920s and 1930s, and that cooperation doesn't really stop with the rise of Hitler. So in Iran in 1939, 1940, you have pro-Nazi Iranian intellectuals. You have pro-Nazi Shiite clerics. You have a racist publication called El Bustan. You have that, and at the same time, Iran throughout the 1930s is letting in German Jewish refugees, German Jewish and Austrian Jewish refugees, which basically it considers just German. So there are categories, professional categories that are developed, which are doctors, engineers, agricultural specialists, foremen, architects, mechanics, musicians, artisans, and people who fit those categories are, in many cases, allowed to come, starting with the rise of Hitler. And I've looked through these documents, and there are many requests for entry visas, as well as, and some of them are granted. And I was telling Professor Milani that since the book came out a month ago, and since then I'm really getting a lot of emails from people who say, oh, my family was in Tehran, I was born in Tehran, and so I think there were not a small number. So you have this sort of German Jewish community. You have other Jewish refugees. You have refugees from Iraq. You have refugees from the Caucasus. You have refugees from Bukhara that fled from the Soviets in the beginning with the Soviet Revolution, and now and then they're all there. So Iran is, maybe like today, a very kind of split place. In September 1942, as we know, so following in September 1942, Anglo-Soviet forces invade Iran, depose the Shah, whom they see as too friendly towards Germany, and anoint his son Muhammad Reza Pahlavi. At that point, Allied soldiers come to Iran. these refugees, really Iran becomes a kind of a center of gravity for Allied soldiers, British soldiers, Soviet soldiers, and of course we know there are zones of influences, as well as these refugees. These refugees. Now, I should say about over 100,000 Polish refugees, Polish Christian refugees come to Iran, and among them, about 5,000 Jewish refugees, among whom are these children. But again, as I was telling Professor Milani, I'm really getting the sense that there are more of them, that there were stowaways, that there were people who entered as, they put a cross on them and they entered as Christian Poles, but they were Jewish and so on. They seem to be many such stories. So these are the people who come, and if you read in my book, you'll see, there are many, many testimonies of just beautiful stories of the receptions that these people receive. It's a very spontaneous reception, because the people who are the Persians, people in Pahlavi, have no idea. It's not that somebody prepares them and somebody says, tomorrow a ship of refugees will come and so on. The ship comes and these children walk off the ship and they look just horrible. And I should say that these are they are in very, very terrible shape. They've undergone extreme starvation. These are just some photos. They have eye diseases, and basically, the British colonel who was in charge of them reports that there 40% of them are malaria cases. General Anders, who is the chief of staff of the Polish army, says that he anticipates that 25% of them will die in Iran. They're in very bad shape, but they're also extremely happy, and individuals see them, and people just respond in this kind of human way without really not in any organized way. There are descriptions of people throwing stuff at them, and they say, I thought like somebody was throwing a stone at me, and then I realized it was like a little napkin with candy inside it, and so on. So very spontaneous, beautiful hospitality that is described in multiple sources. They are, as I said, in very bad shape. I don't know if people know Khosrow Sinai's The Lost Requiem. This is actually a Persian film about the Polish refugees. It's available on YouTube, basically, and although this is the ad for it, so it makes it seem like it's a really happy film, but it's really actually a very sad film, and it begins with Sinai walking through Dulab, which is a Catholic cemetery in Tehran, and Sinai says, I'm looking at these graves, and there are so many graves, and they all have they're in Polish, and they all have death dates that are between 1941 and 1945, and I started to wonder who these are, and then I discovered there are these Polish refugees, but what Sinai doesn't know, that there are also Jewish refugees among them, and this is the grave of a little girl, and this is from Tehran's Jewish cemetery, and there are many such graves in Tehran's Jewish cemetery that are still there, and one can see them. I should say that, and I want to talk a little bit about my own process of working on this book. But I'm an Israeli citizen, so I couldn't travel to Iran. But my colleague, who I just mentioned, I started mentioning, was able to travel there several times and take photos and research there and so on. So this is a photo that he took. The conditions of these children is bad, but they do, and the condition of the Jewish children is especially bad because they were within this larger convoy of Polish refugees. They were discriminated against. They didn't get as much aid. They didn't get as much food. They didn't get as much clothing and so on. So, but they are cared for in Tehran hospitals both in allied hospitals, but also in local hospitals. And this is Dr. Ruchla Sapir, who is a Persian Jewish doctor who actually contracts typhus while caring for the refugees and dies. And he's a very young man. I think he's 30. And as some of you know, that there's the hospital in Tehran, a Jewish hospital, is actually still named after him, the Sapir, Dr. Sapir Hospital, which still exists today. In Yom Kippur, as I said, these children are taken to the synagogue, and I wanted to read to you a passage from the book where they are taken to the synagogue, because it's one of the most fascinating things is to see this encounter, the meeting point between Persian Jews and these European Jews. And needless to say that these communities had not previously had any contact. So I'll just read you a short passage. So a week for Yom Kippur, the children were taken to Tehran synagogues. The idea was the Tehran committees. The Tehran committee is a committee of local Persian Jews and Jewish refugees who are German Jewish refugees and Iraqi Jewish refugees who form a committee to help these refugees. So they bring them clothing, and they take them sometimes for dinner. They actually, believe it or not, take them to see The Great Dictator in a Tehran cinema. I mean, I can't imagine what that would be like, but they do, and children describe that. So they have this idea, and they say, we're going to bring the children to a Tehran synagogue, and this is going to be kind of a fundraiser. The Persian Jewish community is a very poor community at the time, and they really begin to acquire wealth mostly after the war. But they say, we're going to bring these children in, and people are going to be so moved that they'll give something. And indeed, that was the case. So I have another great source that I have are these memoirs that were written by a Polish rabbi who was also a refugee, and he wrote an account of his time in Iran. So for Yom Kippur, the children were taken to Tehran synagogues. The idea was the Tehran committees not only to remove the children from the depressing camp atmosphere, but to present them, particularly the young ones, to worshippers at Tehran synagogues in order to collect alms for the young orphans. It was decided that the children would visit a few of the 18 synagogues inside the Mahala, the Jewish quarters, the makeshift Iraqi synagogue at the Allianz School, and the Chaim and Daniel synagogue, which I just showed you. Actually, let me skip something. So I describe how they actually walked. Basically they walked. It was about 7 miles. They walked for a long time. So the older children walked, and I was able to trace the whole route through Lalazar Street and everything. And so I understand the whole thing. And they walk into the synagogue, and so the local gave them, the children, little gifts and sat with them for Kol Nidrei prayer, which is the prayer for Yom Kippur. Then when they noticed the younger children were absent, they sent a car to fetch them, despite what even their secular counselors knew as the strict prohibition against driving on Yom Kippur. Everyone was already seated by the time the 5- and 6-year-olds and the toddlers walked into the synagogue. So they're really toddlers, they're like 3-year-olds. When the worshippers saw the children, they all began to weep. Tears rolled down the men's cheeks, and the women wept violently. This is a quote from this memoir, and it's really, I mean, I just don't want to belabor you, but it's a very long quote, and it's incredibly moving and sad. And I'll say more about this meeting of these two communities, but I want to say a few things about my own process about working on this book, because the book is also about that. So the book it's about the past, but it's also about the present, my present, which is the present in which I traveled to those places. I traveled to Poland twice. I traveled to Russia, to these areas where people were exiled, which are still very Soviet areas, even though Soviet Union no longer exists. I traveled to Uzbekistan. I traveled to Israel. I traveled to archives. I traveled twice to Stanford, to the Hoover Institute, that has the documents of the Polish army in exile, and to all kinds of archives. And Salar traveled to Iran and researched in Iran. So it took a long time to do that, and especially in many of these places, they're not areas where it's easy to research. In Poland, in Russia, people don't just talk to you and tell you what they think. Archives are not fully accessible. And in Uzbekistan, I couldn't even really travel as an independent researcher. I had to sort of pretend I was a tourist on the tour of the Silk Road or something like that. And I had a kind of clandestine research assistant who was researching for me. But it was very difficult. It's not that you can go there and say, I want to see, NKVD archives, and they'll say, sure, here you go. And so that part was very hard. It's also very hard because of these different ideological. It's not that you could just sort of dig down across 7 decades of communism and Zionism and American liberalism and Polish revisionism and all these different ideologies that shape the way we see the past, and kind of like go into this well and dig it up, and here it is. So all of that took a long time, but really what was hardest in many ways is that, and I think people keep asking me, why was this story not known before? But the truth is that pieces of it were known. It's just that collective memory is a national political thing. So they were known, parts of it are known in different places according to what that country needs to remember. And so, for example, in Israel, the Tehran Children this story is known, but it's known as the story of the kind of rescue of Jewish children and their arrival, their evacuation to the future Jewish state, right? These children arrived in Palestine on February 1943. So they're in the middle of the war. They are the first group of people who are coming from there, from hell, from the war. They're children, and people go nuts. I mean, they have, basically school is canceled, and all the children are in the street, on both sides of the tracks. They're waiting for them. This is actually the cover of my book is that. So these are the local children looking at the children coming. This becomes a kind of not only a celebration, but for many people a raison d'etre for the need for a Jewish state, right? So people are just like, this is, we have refugees and we need a place for them to come and so on. And this is how this story is remembered. This is how I knew it too, growing up in Israel. So it's kind of rescue story. And in fact, I think I almost had a fantasy of, it's almost like these children were airlifted from Poland to Palestine, and in a pretty kind of a happy story. In Poland, this is remembered completely different. This is remembered as a story of the kind of the Soviet deportations, the Soviet persecution of Poles. So all that's remembered is this is a story about the kind of evil Soviet Union and what it did to Polish citizens. So this is a monument for what are called the murdered and fallen of the East. So this is a monument for these refugees. Of course, as you can see, it's all full of crosses, but in fact, most of the refugees were Jewish. So this is a kind of case, in a way, this is something of a case of revisionism, or at least a case of skewed proportions. There is a little Star of David in there. You can't see it, but the emphasis here, in other words, in Polish collective memory, is on deportations. There is no The story of Iran, of Polish refugees in Iran, is a little bit known, but really not. I mean, the fact that most of these people actually left Central Asia and ended up in Iran is not very well known. And certainly what is not known is that the Polish Christian refugees, most of them ended up in Palestine. So what happens is they go to Iran, and then from Iran they're evacuated to Palestine, and they're sort of hosted by the Jews of Palestine. So they go to Hebrew University, and they have Polish schools, and they have all kinds of, they study opera, whatnot. So this is a Polish school in Tel Aviv in 1942. So all this, the kind of migrations of Polish citizens into the Middle East, that's not part of the Polish story at all. And of course we know that in the Soviet Union there is not even a memory of these, I mean, there is a memory, but there's no commemoration of the deportations altogether, so that's not even part of that story. And in Iran, I think, I don't know how much people know, but I think there is some knowledge of the Polish refugees, and Lost Requiem, the movie, I think, has brought that there, but I don't think there is a lot of awareness that there were Jews among them. So what my book ended up doing is kind of marrying all these different archives and these different nationalist stories to kind of tell the complete story. So I kind of hopped between these different archives and these different nationalist stories to really tell a kind of global history of the Holocaust, which is not a history that's set inside Nazi-occupied Europe, but it really involves this whole other complex geopolitical world, which is the world that has having to do with the Soviet Empire and the British Empire and the Iranian government and Iranian people and the Persian Jewish community and the Zionist Agency of Palestine and American Jewish aid organizations. And I kind of worked through all their archives and put this whole story together. After I was and some of it is really just being able to shake off the biases and the ideologies and the ways we think, and especially as academics, we have certain ways of thinking. When I was able to shake a lot of it off, I understood a few things. One thing I understood was that I understood that this journey and the extent of my father's suffering and all these refugees, and that this was not a kind of airlift from Poland to Palestine, that this was a very, very protracted, arbitrary path of suffering and so on. I also understood how arbitrary our identities are, or people's, because we know we only know the present. My father, to me, was an Israeli guy, but really, when you track down refugee stories, every point of transit is also an end point to so many different people. So people stayed in Siberia. When I was in Russia, I realized that many people, they were released from these settlements, and then they said, where are we going to go? It's a war. Maybe we have small children. Maybe somebody gave us a cow or something, and we said, okay, we'll live the war in here. And then they got trapped behind the Iron Curtain. They became Russians, or Soviets and then Russians. People stayed in Uzbekistan. So I interviewed this woman. This was a Polish Jewish woman, just like my father and my aunt, and she married. She came there, and she lost her family. She met an Uzbek man, and she married him, and she's an Uzbek woman now. And I interviewed her in Samarkand. And people stayed in Iran. This guy, Reza Nikpour, his mother is Polish. His father was a Polish refugee. His father is Iranian. He still lives in Iran. They own a shoe store, as I understand it. In fact, he has a little miniature makeshift archive in the basement of the shoe store with all the documents of these refugees. And since the book came out, several people have shown up in my talks and told me these kind of stories, basically mostly stories of Polish, including Polish Jewish women who marry Iranian men and remained in Iran sometimes until 79. So basically had children there, and those children are now here. So they became Iranian. And that's a kind of simple but somehow very startling insight. In the 1940s, the Soviet government was actually actively encouraging people to adopt children, to adopt refugee and evacuee children. So this is actually an Uzbek blacksmith who adopted 10 children from different nationalities, as you can see, including Korean children who were also deported, Jewish, from every kind, and he was considered a great patriot, and there was all these articles about him in Pravda and so on. So these children became Uzbek. In Iran, where basically you have Jewish children, Jewish Polish children, Christian Polish children, and this is really, in Iran, is where to a large degree the Jewish Polish and the Christian Polish identity is completely separate. Christian children, for the most part, are taken to Isfahan and are taken to, they are housed in all kinds of convents there, and in the house, there's a kind of huge villa that was owned by Prince Sarem Odole, who was he was a kind of pro-British former governor of Isfahan, and he gave his residence. So these children are housed there, and they live in there is a Persian photographer called Parisa Damandan who has a book called Children of Isfahan, and she says they lived behind closed doors in a Polish environment. She says they really live in a kind of miniature Poland, the way she describes it. They study Polish language, and it's a very nationalistic education, and they're treated very well, and so on. And so Iran Iran's multi-ethnic makeup actually sort of allows for these for this kind of Poland of Isfahan to develop in there, as well as also. Then this is true for the Jewish children's home as well. So this is my father right here, who's the one with the hair. And it actually pleases me that he had hair, because the children had, of course, tremendous lice, and I don't know, somehow he was able to keep his hair. So this is, they have a kind of Zionist, socialist Zionist camp. The counselors are recruited from among the refugees. These are young, the counselors are slightly older than the children. They're in their 20s. They were in sort of Zionist youth movements in Poland. So they're there. And as I said, they are soon evacuated. I wanted to read you another passage from this the rabbi that I told you about, who describes his experiences in Tehran, because they're just incredibly moving passages. So first of all, this is how he describes walking to the synagogue. He's walking to a different synagogue, which is an Iraqi synagogue, a synagogue that was put together by Iraqi refugees. So he says, "It is a special feeling a man has after an interruption of 2.5 years when he goes to pray publicly in a communal synagogue with an ark and a Torah scroll. Only a Spanish converso would understand it. It's been 27 months since I had heard the reading of the Torah, months where every public prayer was a crime against the laws of the land. And here, in Tehran, a man walks with his head high, a talit, under his arm, in a bustling city, amid a crowd of people, dressed festively, walking to the synagogue in the wealthy quarter." So he describes at length sort of walking in the streets, and there are all these people there, and he gets to this makeshift synagogue. This is the Alliance School, was a Jewish. This was a French-based Jewish school chain, and they had a school in Tehran. And in the courtyard, these Iraqi Jews made a synagogue, and this is how he describes it. This is a little bit of a long quote, but I think it's just beautiful. "At the large courtyard of the Alliance School, by the pool, these wealthy Arabs," so he calls them basically Arab Jews, arranged a spot for them to pray during the high holidays. They spread carpets, brought in a lounge and armchairs, a Torah ark, a table for Torah reading, and tents for protection from the sun. And thus, a temporary synagogue was erected. For the women, they placed seats in the balconies surrounding the garden so that they too could hear the prayer. I admit that prayer in this place left a unique impression on me. There was nothing about it or the atmosphere inside our synagogues during high holidays. Our synagogues meaning like Polish synagogues. No trace of the seriousness, the high-mindedness, the dread, the awe that characterized our prayers. The men, dressed in pressed white suits, sat in a half circle around the pool, as if they were in a ball at a country club. The cool air, the pools with a tiny goldfish, and the tent above only strengthened this impression. Many small children, some without a hat, ran around the yard, but they did not interrupt the prayers. I saw and thought about what I saw. Perhaps these Baghdadi Jews have preserved Yom Kippur prayer in its original form. Perhaps it is appropriate to celebrate Yom Kippur with joy and happiness, to send flowers to each other, and to act not as slaves dreading their rabbi, but as children who have sinned before their father and know that all will be forgiven. And I found this passage very extraordinary, and I think if I would have read this passage early on, just at the beginning of my research, I would have been, he's like this kind of like colonial mentality of this European Jew who's kind of looking down on these local Jews, and they're calling them, sort of saying they don't pray properly and so on. But I really understood it, knowing what I knew about what these refugees went through, the kind of suffering. This man who basically was he was not only a rabbi but a professor, and who basically has lost everything, who has nothing, who has no home, who has no family, who has no wealth, who has no synagogue, no community, and he's seeing these people, and I think he really does see, maybe this is okay, maybe we just should really have empathy and feel more less judgmental and less harsh, and just be and just kind of cherish whatever we can cherish, family and beauty and mercy and forgiveness. And I really do think that he saw this as a moment of tranquility, and that he embraced this vision of a more merciful and empathic God, and I see this in other descriptions too, of people have these moments in Iran where they're like, the sun is setting. There's something very soft, because I think being a refugee and having gone through this experience reshuffles everything, right? And I think as I was researching this book, and as I continued working on it more and more, this really became my vision as well. I feel like I developed, a lot of empathy towards everybody. And so not only the Jewish refugees, because I didn't actually just write a story about Jewish refugees. I wrote a story about other refugees, the Polish refugees at large. I wrote a story about the host nations, about Iran, about the communities, about the rescuers, about aid organizations, about ordinary citizens, and this is a larger history. Stalin deported 33 million people, so this is also, there were many people were deported. I was one of the things, this by the way is Rabbi Zev Hirschberg. I forgot to turn the slides, but this is this man. But I should say that in my own research, so in every one of those places I had a host and somebody who helped me, including starting off with Salar, who of course was instrumental, but also with Magda Gowen was my host in Poland, and she actually is a kind of nationalistic Catholic historian who just ended up being a person from my father's hometown, who helped me This is my host in Russia. And again, the areas that I went to, this is, I think, the most fun chapter in this book, because this guy was just kind of a mini oligarch. And he helped open doors in Russia, doors that were not previously open to researchers. And this was my research assistant in Uzbekistan, who is a Korean Uzbek who lives there. And, you know, Jewish history, and especially the history of the Holocaust, it's a very heavy weight to carry. And in that sense, I didn't want to carry that weight either. I would rather write about British Romanticism. I'm an English lit scholar, but and it's very helpful and moving when other people help you carry it, and especially non-Jews help you carry it. And this was maybe the best part of this journey, in a way, starting with Professor Mellon's article, and throughout with these. I mean, Sergei Kim actually is a Presbyterian minister in Uzbekistan. That's just not, that's a dangerous thing to do, and it was a dangerous thing for him to help me. And so the help that I received and the dialogues that I had with people was extraordinary. At the same time, this is not a kind of We Are the World book, in the sense that, when you want people to help you, but the person who helps you has their own history, right? So Salar was a refugee of 1979. Sergei Kim's family they were deported, went through Korean Uzbeks, went through horrible deportations. Magda Gawen's great aunt was killed by the Nazis. And so people have their own stories of their own traumas, and those stories sometimes clash, right? So Iran and Israel today, as we know, and also Polish Christian and Polish Jewish narratives back then, and in some ways now. And I think my book offers maybe a third option, or it offers an option of dialogue that works through these impasses and through the difficulties of such a dialogue. And that has been, I think, the most exhilarating part of this book. Thank you. So, because we have time for questions, right? Yeah. Yes?
Thank you for your fascinating talk. It was fantastic.
Thank you.
Sad but fantastic. I have a couple of small questions. You talked about your father as a survivor of Holocaust. I'm wondering if your father had like the tattoo number on the things, one of the questions. The other one, when Soviet Union deported people, why they send in that way to Iran? Why not from the south to Uzbekistan or to Azerbaijan to Iran? And then the third question, when your father and the group were in Iran, how many years were there? Because your father is like a 18 years old guy, kind of, in that last picture.
14.
14. But did they get adopted by anyone, or just all those years they lived in just themselves?
Yeah. So the first question is, so they did not have tattoos, and they were not. These are the people who fled. In the case of my family, they fled from the Germans. So they fled into the Soviet Union. So they were not interned in concentration camps. And one of the things. One of the, the terrible ironies of this story is that, so in the case of my family, they are a huge clan in the town that they're from, a really huge clan, like 70 people. Many of them flee. When they get to the border, some of them, like my grandfather, after a while, after about 6 months, and they're living in the Soviet Union, in this, there's a refugee crisis on the border. Actually, maybe I can just go back to the map and I'll show you. They live on, so after 6 months or so, Oh, now I went too far. So after 6 months or so, my grandfather decides he's going to go back to the German side. So they're basically right here. They're from here, they flee, and they're right here, okay, on the border. Not only them, but the uncles and other members of the family. After about 6 months, my grandfather says, I've had enough of these Soviets. Conditions here are terrible. I want to go back to my home. I'm going to go back to the German side. Because you have to remember that German Jews already survived a German occupation in World War I, and they're thinking, well, it wasn't that bad. We survived. We'll go back. Because he decides to go back, that's the reason they're arrested and deported, right? So the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, boards them on trains and tells them, yeah, you're going back home, get on. But the trains go east instead of west, okay? So the stupid decision to go back to the Nazi side saves them. The ones who make the smart decision, which is we'll stay on the Soviet side, which is a large part of my father's family, basically they remain right here, and they kind of do okay. They survive in the beginning, and they, in the case of my great uncle, they know something about beer. He starts being a beer supervisor or something like that here. When the German army, when the Wehrmacht invades the Soviet Union, the first thing they do is they kill the Jews who are here, who are on the border. Either they kill them right away, or they put them in ghettos, and then they deport them to concentration camps. So those are the people who get deported to concentration camps. The people who get deported to the special settlements and the gulags are not, they fled from the Nazis. Your second question of what happens to them in Iran, so as I said, most of the children who are part of, so there are different faiths, but most of the children who are in that tent camp that I showed you end up being evacuated to Palestine after about 7 months, okay? So they don't stay in Iran that long. They stay in Iran for about 6-7 months. Some children stay a little bit longer. There are a few transports. Some Jewish children who are in part of the Polish camps and are not in the Jewish camps end up being sometimes evacuated to India, to Lebanon, some East Africa, all kinds of places. Some children, there are stories, even though I haven't been able to trace these children, but Iranian Jews have told me that some children were adopted by Iranian Jewish families, a few children. So they don't, but I haven't been able to trace any of them. Some Polish Jewish adults stay in Iran for the duration of the war, as I said, and some of them to this day, I guess. But I don't know if there was another question, but...
Your father, how long your father were in Iran, for instance, as an example?
7 months.
Just 7 months?
Yeah. Yes.
It's my understanding that when Khomeini came into power in '79, that his justification for allowing Jews to live in Iran to this very day, yet at the same time when they're calling for the destruction of Israel, is just that separation. That these are Jews of Iran and completely separate from, if you will, the Zionists, the Jews. This might be completely unfair. Do you think that at that time, '79, did he have knowledge, do you think, of even this experience of these, say, 1,000 plus Jews that were essentially saved by Iran? And if so, do you think that even could have influenced that edict that he provided at that time?
Well, the interesting thing, I don't remember if I have these slides here. The interesting thing that happens, and this is always, I think with refugees, there are always these unintended consequences, because the refugees come to a place, they're changed by the place, and they change the place that they come to. And after these children came, after these children came, basically, Jewish American organizations came to Iran to help these children and to help and then they stayed in Iran. So they sort of discovered Iran. And this is, in fact, Tehran becomes the base from which aid packages are sent to refugees in the Soviet Union. So this is Tehran, 1943, 1944. Representatives of the Jewish Agency of Palestine also come to Iran and also stay in Iran. And I don't know if people know this, but in the post-war period, in the 50s and especially the 60s and the 70s, there are tens of thousands of Israelis working in Iran. In some ways, the Israelis replaced the Germans as in the engineers and agricultural specialists and so on who are helping and doing things in Iran. And so I think the seed of that begins with these children, with these refugees, because you have to remember that, so for example, these people right here, Solel Boneh is a kind of a construction brigade that was based in Palestine. These guys were working for the Anglo-Iranian oil company when the children were there. And some of them were Zionists, some of them were not Zionists, but they are interacting with these children. They are interacting with the local population, and in many ways, when the representatives of the Zionist Agency of Palestine come to Iran, they are discovering, little by little, they realize that the people who were their people, right, the reserves of the Zionist movement, who were basically Polish Jewish youth, who were part of were in youth movements in Palestine, they're realizing they're going to die, they're going to be murdered, and they will not exist anymore. And they're thinking, who are going to be our reserves? And then they sort of turn around, they say, well, there are like Iranian Jews here, and they start having contact with Iranian Jews. So all these networks start with these refugees. So they were very present. I mean, so I don't know, that doesn't really answer your question. And maybe Professor Mellon knows. I don't know if Khomeini would have known about these refugees, but I think he knew of the Jews in Iran. Jews have lived in Iran for a very long time, and that the synagogue that I showed you, the Chaim and Daniel synagogue, is still a synagogue that operates. It has a very, very small constituency, but I have photos from there and so on. People go there and in high holidays and so on. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could tell me, first of all, thank you, it was a really fascinating talk. Could you tell me a little bit more about the interactions between Iranian Jews and post-Jewish refugees? What were the perceptions they had of one another? Did the children interact in any sort of like educational way? So if you kind of talk about those sort of interactions and perceptions.
Yeah, I mean, I think the children, these children at least, were in the tent camp, and they were not really. They would here and there, like I said, they would be taken to movies, or they would be taken to Shabbat dinners at people's homes. I think sometimes they would be taken for like a whole weekend or something, but they didn't go to Persian schools. They didn't go to any school. I mean, they basically were sort of in this camp, getting a little bit of Jewish education, but not that much of it, in the sense that their counselors were mostly, they were kind of socialist, from the Shomer HaTzair, the socialist Zionist movement. So they weren't, and they were very young and so on. So they were kind of, they would have these drills and so on. I think the interaction is very, when there is an interaction, there is a total fascination. I think there's a total fascination between the two sides. In Hirschberg's descriptions, and I can give you that essay, he describes at length kind of what people eat and one thing that he's very fascinated by is how he feels like the Persian Jewish children are very respectful and obedient to their parents, and he's sort of saying, you know, our youth is not like that. They're so rebellious, and he's just the way he watches how the children treat their father and so on. So you do have that. There are people who live in Tehran, like I said, more people who are stowaways, people who are not part of this group. They don't have a lot of contact with. They live in kind of like these refugee communities. Yes.
Thank you so much. It's fascinating, and I'm really happy your book is finding an audience beyond academia. My question is, what happened to your father's younger sister?
I mean, they came together. In fact, there was also a cousin who was, so the three children came together to Palestine, and they were raised in a kibbutz. Let me see if this is my father. I'm very bad with this technology. He was raised in a kibbutz, which is a collective settlement in northern Israel. And my aunt, you know, I'm very sad to say that she passed away 6 months ago, and I was really hoping she would be alive to see this book come out. She was very, very helpful to me. This is, by the way, an Uzbek family who I was able to trace where the kind of village that my father was in, and these actually the people who live there. And they were incredibly sweet, and what they said is that they remembered the stories of these refugees is kind of told to them by their parents and grandparents, and it was really wonderful. They actually, so I told you that my father died from mad cow disease, and we always wondered. There are very few cases of these in Israel. We always wondered where he contracted this, and now I think, following my research, probably in Uzbekistan. So what these guys told me is that how they were told that these refugees they were so hungry that they basically got off the trains and they started eating like live frogs and things like that. So you know, he must have eaten something poisonous there, So they were basically raised in a kibbutz and then lived in Israel for the rest of their lives. All three of them. Their cousin is still alive. Yes.
Two questions. I may have missed this. The children, your dad and his sister came, but not the parents. Were they not offered the opportunity to come?
Yes, they were not offered the opportunity to come because basically, I mean, this is a very critical question. So basically, the Polish army in exile was allowed to evacuate from the Soviet Union to Iran with the idea, so basically the Polish government in exile, which was in London, convinced the Soviets that they have to let the army evacuate, because if they don't let the army evacuate, the soldiers will just die of hunger before they fight anybody. That's how it started. Then everybody wanted to get out of the Soviet Union, so they said, okay, then we'll allow the soldiers' families. And then kind of the circles of civilians became larger and larger. As a rule, Jews, unless they were part of the Anders army, and there are very few Jews in the Anders army, were not allowed. The Soviets saw Jews, they did not see them as Polish citizens. The Soviets didn't allow them to be evacuated. The Poles didn't want to take them out because they, you know, for their own reasons. I mean, they wanted to have a kind of ethnically Christian Polish state in the post-war period, so they preferred that the Jews stay in the Soviet Union. The British didn't want the Jews to be evacuated because they felt like if they're evacuated, they'll make it to Palestine, and they were already dealing with Arab-Jewish conflict there. So, in other words, none of these entities had the motivation, let's say, so in other words, so they were not allowed, the parents were not allowed, taking the children out was a kind of humanitarian thing that was negotiated, but people did get out, I mean, in all kinds of in all kinds of ways.
And
Yeah.
follow on, so maybe you don't know, but how do you think this all affected your dad? Did you ever learn from him on what that was like? And
Yeah, you know, as I started out by saying, my father didn't say a word about what he went through. I sort of knew, the story that I just told you about the fact that some of the family decided to stay and they got killed, and the other side so, and that's kind of a little bit of the philosophy I grew up on, which is not a good philosophy, right? It's very nihilistic, which has been whatever decision you make, it means nothing because, at the end, fate will decide. So, but he really didn't talk about the war, and he didn't talk about what happened before the war. And I think one of the problems, and Professor Milani and I were talking about this before, is that when you have no story, then no larger story, then in a way you don't even know you have a story. In other words, if we know about Auschwitz, right? So if I discovered that my father was an Auschwitz survivor, I would have read Primo Levi, I would have read Art Spiegelman, I would have known what that means to be in Auschwitz, but there was no story of this as a story, and so people didn't think they had a story. And it's astonishing to me. People have been writing me and saying to me, my mother was in Uzbekistan and I thought she was the only one there. And I'm like, 250,000 people were there. He thought if he was the only one there, because if the story wasn't told, then, and the same about Iran. I had, a really funny thing happen to me when somebody said to me, same thing, somebody said to me, I was at the home of somebody and he said, he was very neurotic about food, and he said, well, I don't know, my mom is a Holocaust survivor, but she has this crazy story, she was in Tehran. She was in Tehran, she got there, and I heard that some Russian soldier took her there, and I said, show me the documents, and I looked at the dates, and she was basically sent to Tehran exactly at the date when the rest of them were released from the settlements. And I said to him, I'm sorry to tell you, but that Russian soldier is Joseph Stalin, and she was just part of this larger story. But he was like, oh my God, I had no idea. So, in some ways, I think, my book is going to be the story through which people can understand their own experiences. And I think, so for my dad, he didn't have a story, and again, we have to understand that within this, I think, larger horror of the Holocaust, where the concentration camp and the life under Nazi occupation, that became the Holocaust, right? That's like, and the concentration camp is the kind of governing symbol of the Holocaust, and the refugee was not, and this was supposedly, these were the lucky ones, right? But, when you research this, you're like, this can only be considered lucky under these extreme circumstances. Yeah.
In that town where your family was born, is there anyone left?
No, nobody is left, and none of their properties, nothing is left there. They did, however, astonishingly, so that family, which basically most of which was murdered and none of whom stayed there, was investigated for Zionism in 1968 in the kind of phantom investigations that were going on in the late 1960s. So I was able to get a lot of these documents. But no, nobody's left there, and in some ways, that whole Jewish presence has been erased, even though now there's some attempts to renovate the cemetery and so on. But no.
Thank you for your focus. I was wondering, most of the pictures and stories were of boys. Did the children of Tehran consist almost only of boys?
No.
And okay.
Mm-hmm.
Were girls also amongst them, or left behind with the Soviet as well?
No, girls were amongst them. Yes, it was boys and girls, and like I said, a lot of different ages, anywhere from there are children who were born along the right, so like age 2 to 17.
There were a lot of Jewish families and living freely in Iran. How come they didn't keep the children in Tehran? Were they forced to go to
No, no, they were not forced, but they were. I mean, that's a good question, but they were basically Jewish aid organizations and Jewish organizations in Palestine. And they knew what was happening. They were following these refugees already when they're in the settlements, and they were trying to find ways to help them. So they, I think that was already, in a way, it was already planned that they would be evacuated. When they got to Iran, the plan was to evacuate them. It's just that they couldn't evacuate them, and they couldn't find a way to evacuate them, because if you look at the map, if you look at this map, so Tehran and Tel Aviv are of course very close, right? I mean, it's one day when there'll be peace. We can go. It's 48 hours maybe, I think, in a car ride. But of course, the children couldn't be evacuated to Iraq because Iraq wouldn't let Jewish children be evacuated to Palestine in 1943. So, in fact, Eleanor Roosevelt intervenes here, and she intervenes with the Iraqi Prime Minister, and she says to him, she writes him, and she says, "This is a humanitarian case. These are children. Let them through." And he says, "We're very sorry. We feel for these children, and we'd be happy to keep them in Iraq if you sponsor them." So they actually end up having to go to this really crazy route through the Indian Ocean, and it's full of German land and sea mines, and then through the Suez Canal, so they through Aden and then Egypt and so on. There's one incredibly moving scene. Their ship stops in Aden, and it's a British warship. The children are on it, and the children are told, you have to go down below and hide because this is, hostile territory and so on. But they're children, so of course they can't stay put, so they immediately go up on dock, and all these, basically Yemenite, all these children from around them are basically kind of jumping and swimming around them, and the children say, there are these diaries, and the children say, it's the first time we saw children that look worse than us. And they go down below, and they get the food that is in the kitchen, because of course now that they're on the British warship, they have tons of food there. They get the food, and they start throwing it to the kids in the sea, and the kids jump in and get it. So, that happens too. No. So most of them are evacuated. Yes.
Thanks for your interest and information. I had two questions, now I have three questions. First one is that in an article I was reading about a story of a Iranian Schindler who was supposedly Iranian diplomat living in either Denmark or UK, and then he made Iranian passport for I was wondering how much do you think this story is valid, and if your father mentioned anything?
Why don't you answer that?
Yes, the name is Sarwadi.
Yes,
I've written about it in Persian Things. There's now a documentary made about him that spans the story. And he's not the only Iranian diplomat. There are Iranian diplomats in Lebanon, Iranian diplomats in Africa who sold Iranian, sometimes sold and sometimes gave away Iranian passports to Jews. There are several thousand Jews, European Jews, that were thus saved. The story of Sarwadi is absolutely correct.
My second question, sir. From your experience in your encounters among the Jewish community, how informed do you think they are about this hospitality of the Middle Easterns, or specifically Iranians, during the World War II? How informed?
I mean, there are many Jewish communities, I guess, but I think it's actually not very well known. Even for me, in the beginning, I had to. I mean, when I started interviewing Persian Jews, of course this is also, people are very old and so on, but the people would tell me stories about hospitality, and I would be like, I want to find an independent source for this, because when you're researching a story like this, everybody tells you that they helped, right? The Bukhari Jews tell you that they hate, but I discovered, when I was able to corroborate it, and I think they collected money and so on. In many ways, that is not very well known. The Iranian Jews know, but in Israel and I think elsewhere, it's been a little bit that history has been a little bit lost, but it's not going to be lost anymore. Hopefully, if people read my book.
Can I ask my third question?
Is that okay?
Last one, yeah?
Yeah.
Go ahead and
No, last one. Yes. Go ahead.
Last question.
About you said there was this Jewish aid organization, right? And they're organized to bring all the Jews to Israel, right? So my question is that how was this decision made that all the Jews from all around Central Asia or Middle East to be collected and live in Israel?
No, that's not at all the case. I mean, the only ones that were evacuated to Israel were these children, people who basically my grandparents and most Polish Jews who remained in Central Asia. Most of them. They remained in Central Asia for the duration of the war. In 1945, there was a repatriation agreement between Poland and the Soviet Union. Many of them went back to Poland. So the typical route was this. They would go back to Poland. They would find that they have nothing to go back to. They would very quickly leave, and they would end up in a displaced persons camp in Europe, in Germany or in Austria or in Italy. So, in fact, they could not go to Palestine because the British were controlling Palestine. They were not allowing Jews into Palestine at the time. And my father could actually not reunite with his parents for years after the war. My grandparents ended up in a displaced persons camp in Germany, and my grandfather actually died there, unfortunately, of tuberculosis. So he's buried in Munich, and my grandmother only came after the creation of Israel, so in '49. And many of them didn't go to Israel. It's just, sometimes they went to America, depending on where they could go, and sometimes they spent years and years and years in displaced persons camps. In some ways, what's horrible about it is that 45 is only the kind of middle of their ordeal.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for coming.